Hello and welcome to Science Ridge Mennonite Church, where we believe in sharing Christ's love and growing believers. Let's tune in to today's message. We are going to continue looking at the grand story of the Bible. We looked at creation, we looked at the fall, we looked at God's call on the family of Abraham, and now we are in a section of Scripture where the patriarchs and matriarchs take center stage. So if you're reading the Bible in this section, you have stories about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the story of Joseph and some of other of Jacob's sons. Today we're going to focus in on just one of those stories in the vast multitude of stories going on here. We're going to look at the story of Tamar in Genesis 38. This is a little bit of a different story in the Bible, and it really shows us how this family is not a perfect family. It has flaws. The people make mistakes. The leaders, the ancestors of this family, make mistakes. So let's tune in and learn about the story of Tamar. We started over the last few weeks talking about God's good creation, how God created by the spoken word Debar. Then we saw the problem. Humanity has gone our own way. We want to be like God. We want our own way, right? That's evident. Humans are full of pride, believing that we should be equal to God. We're full of violence, using force to control the world around us. And we talked about how sin breaks those four relationships between ourselves and God, ourselves and others, brokenness within ourselves, and even creation suffers. And then last week we saw how God was going to solve the problem of sin and begin to restore what sin has broken. And we saw that God has chosen this family, a people through whom God would bring blessing to the world. They are going to be blessed. Abraham's name will be made great. The people of Abraham will be a great people. But they're not chosen because they're special. They're chosen for a purpose. Today we will see an example of an imperfect people. That God has chosen an imperfect family, a very relatable family in many ways, and how God continues to work with this family despite their imperfection. Now, this story in Genesis 38 is one of those stories that really we have a hard time making sense of it unless we know what some of the cultural context is. It's kind of a little bit of an outlier. It's in the middle of the story of Joseph. We have the story of Joseph, and then suddenly the story of Judah and Tamar in there, and then it continues with the story of Joseph. So to begin with, as we look at this chapter, I'm going to take just a section of this sermon and talk about the type of Bible study we do when we get to these passages that are full of different terms and ideas that we don't necessarily understand in our context. So there's many different ways that we can read and understand the Bible. I'm going to just list three of them here. We can read the Bible devotionally. This is a common way that we read the Bible. When you're reading the Bible devotionally, it means that you read it to hear or you read it to connect personally with God. You might be reading a section and there might be words that speak to you in a way that don't necessarily match the context, but God uses them to bring you comfort or to speak to you or minister to you in some way. So, for example, a popular verse that's used for this is Jeremiah 29:11. Do you have Jeremiah 29:11 memorized? For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. That's a very comforting Bible verse. But that Bible verse is not speaking to us today. It was written to the people in exile, the people of Israel in exile. It's not a universal promise that God gives to everyone, because we know sometimes we do experience harm. Sometimes people don't prosper even though they are obedient to God. But God can use this verse and it can speak to us and comfort us in times of need. So that is what it would mean to read the Bible devotionally. We see it, it gives us comfort, God speaks to us, but it's not necessarily the original intent for those words. You can also read the Bible allegorically. When you read it allegorically, it's where you look for symbols that are connected to other things. So, for example, the story of Jonah in the whale. You can read that story as a man named Jonah, and he gets swallowed by a whale trying to avoid going to Nineveh. Or you can read it as a symbolic story of the people of Israel straying away from God and this message that God has given them for the world. So there's maybe a larger symbolism that we can put on top of the story. Another example of this would be the Good Samaritan. So in the story of the Good Samaritan, We know this story as a parable of a man that gets robbed and hurt by the side of the road, and two people pass the man by, but there is one that stops. And so we're familiar with that story. You could read that as an allegory, saying that Jesus is the Good Samaritan that stops. He's rejected by all the other people and rejected by the priests and the Pharisees, but he stops, and he helps us when we are broken and hurting, and he pays the cost of our recovery like the Samaritan paid for the man's bill. So that would be a way of reading that as an allegory, a symbolism for something different. Now, that's not a very popular way of doing it today. You can kind of abuse it, and you can see all kinds of stuff if you're really looking for it. But it was common in the first couple centuries of the church to read the Bible allegorically. The way of studying the Bible that we're going to talk about today is called inductive Bible study. Now, like I said, there are more than just these three ways of doing it, but we're going to talk about these three, and inductive is what we're going to look at today. This type of study tries to understand what the story meant to the original audience and what kind of truths or teachings did they take away from it that we could maybe apply to our world today. So we can think about it as we're observing it, we're interpreting it, and then we're applying it. So we can ask, what is this saying? What does this mean? And how do we apply it to our life? So I'm going to read here the story in Genesis 38. And as we go, I invite you to observe this passage, and you can maybe even write down little words or events or things that you might think are important to understand what's going on or that don't make sense to you. And I will say on the front end, because we value having children and young people a part of our service, I'm going to tame down some of the sections in this passage. So you are welcome to read this on your own and see the full depth of what it's saying, but I'm going to censor it just slightly for our reading here today. Now, in Genesis 38, the context here, we had Abraham, who we learned about last time. He had a son named Isaac. Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. And Jacob is the one that God chose then to continue on this mission of bringing blessing to the world. Jacob has 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel. And this story is about one of those sons, the son named Judah. And it takes place, as I said, in the midst of the story of Joseph, perhaps even soon after Joseph is sold into Egypt. There's some thought that Joseph was sold off into Egypt, and Judah was feeling so bad about it that he separated himself from the family for a time. So I'll read here in Genesis chapter 38. And it begins by saying this: At that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hira. There Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married this woman and made love to her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son who was named She conceived again and gave birth to a son named Onan, and she gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. It was at Kebiz that she gave birth to him. Judah got a wife for his firstborn son, and named her Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, Sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the child would not be his, so he did not fulfill his duty. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, Live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah shows up. For he thought, maybe he would die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's household. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah, to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hiram, the Adullamite, went with him. When Tamar was told, Your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow clothes and covered herself with a veil to disguise herself. Then she sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah had now grown up, and she had not been given to him as his wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing who she was, he went over and said, Let me sleep with you. And what will you give me if I sleep with you? She asked. I'll send you a young goat for my flock, he said. Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it? She asked. He said, What pledge should I give you? Your seal and its cord, and the staff in your hand, she answered. So he gave them to her, and he slept with her, and she became pregnant. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow clothes again. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite in order to get his pledge back from her, but he could not find the woman.
He asked the men who lived there, "Where is this shrine prostitute who is beside the road?" "There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here," they said. So he went back to Judah and said, "I didn't find her." Besides, the men who lived there said, "There hasn't been any shrine prostitutes here." And then Judah said, "Let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her what I promised, but you couldn't find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law, Tamar, is guilty of sleeping with another man. As a result, she is now pregnant." And Judah said, "Bring her out and have her punished." As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law and said, "I am pregnant by the man who owns these," she said. And she added, "See if you can recognize the seal and the cord and the staff that these belong to." Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I would not give her to my son, Shelah." And he did not sleep with her again. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand, so the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, "This one came out first." But then he drew back his hand, and his brother came out. And she said, "So this is how you have broken out." And he was named Perez. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was named Zerah. Okay, there was a lot going on there in that passage. Now, you might have a different list of some of the things that stood out to you, and I could have added more, but here's a few things that I wrote down. Why did God put to death? Why did Onan have to die? Why did she go to her father's house as a widow? The sheep shearing, all these different things there you can see. And we can look at the bigger question too. Why is this story even here in the Bible? Now, if you're going to do a true inductive Bible study, you would look up these terms and these ideas to understand them better. Nowadays, you could go on the internet, you could type in this passage and find a whole bunch of different people and their thoughts on what it means. The internet has advanced so much more, even from when I was in college doing studies on these passages. But I'm not going to go through all of these today, but this is the kind of thing that a good pastor does when they're preparing a sermon. They look at the context, they understand what it's saying, and they look for things that maybe we don't catch in our time and culture. And then we try to communicate these lessons to our audience. So I'm going to go through this passage again, kind of paraphrased, point out some of the things that are going on culturally, and then we will look at how we might apply these things, transport them to our day today. So let's walk through this just a little bit here. We see, as we're going through Genesis 38, that Judah leaves the family. After Joseph is sold into Egypt, he goes to Adullam. That's a Canaanite city. And it turns out that Adullam, just a little background thing, was near where David hid. There's caves near there, and some of the stories of David in caves happens near Adullam. And Judah marries. He has 3 children, Onan, and Shelah. And marries Tamar. They don't have any children. And is evil, it says. And in Genesis, it says that God decided to end life. Now, that is going to give us pause, because the God that we understand from the New Testament isn't like that. And we're going to come back to that topic in a couple of weeks to understand that whole idea a little bit more. But for now, is dead. And now what does Onan, her brother-in-law, do? Why? Why does Onan, her brother-in-law, need to help Tamar have a child? This is important for the culture. This is a term, you're not going to find this in the passage, but it's called levirate marriage. That's important for understanding what is happening in this passage. This was practiced by the Jewish people. It's actually recorded in Deuteronomy 25, but it was also practiced in different parts of Africa and Asia. And so with this practice, a brother marries his widowed sister-in-law. The first child from that marriage is considered the child of the deceased man in order to carry on his line and lineage. Okay? So this was a practice going on even before the law that God gave. And then in Deuteronomy 25, it's actually codified. And God says in Deuteronomy 25, if brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside of the family. Must not marry outside of the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. So that's Deuteronomy 25, starting in verse 5. So Onan here, with this practice of levirate marriage, was supposed to help Tamar have a child. That was the custom, that was his duty, that was his responsibility as a good member of the family. But he doesn't want the child. He doesn't want it to be considered, because that child wouldn't be considered his. And so also there's a little bit of this going on. If Tamar dies without having children, then he gets a little bit more of the inheritance as well. So there's some of this that might be going on too. So eventually Onan does die because he is failing his duty with Terah. And now Judah has only one son left. His two other sons, and Onan, have died, and he's left with Shelah. And we read that Judah was afraid that Shelah would die too, and so he puts off giving Tamar to him. And so Tamar is sent back to her father's house until Shelah is older. He says, just wait till Shelah grows up a bit. Now notice here in this story, Tamar, as a woman, is treated basically like property, right? She is given, she is sent. She does not have any agency on her own. And that was part of the context of the times. Women were vulnerable. If there was no man in particular that would support her, then she didn't have very many options. She could beg by the side of the road, or she could offer herself out or offer her body out for others. Women were at the mercy of the men in their lives, the husbands, the fathers, their fathers-in-law, in order to have care, to be able to live and have what they need. And Judah, as the head of the family, was in charge of caring for his family. He was in charge of caring not only for his sons, but also for his daughter-in-laws, their spouses, the children. He is the head. He is responsible for making sure everyone under his roof has what they need. So we've observed here a little bit. We've gotten a handle of the context. We've learned a bit about what it means. Now we can talk about how we can start to apply this to our world. So we can, you might be able to draw some things out from that. One of the things that I picked up here is the question, does fear of the future ever stop you from doing the right thing? We learned that the right thing in that context was for Judah to give Tamar to the next son, to fulfill the importance of levirate marriage, to continue that on. But he is afraid, and so he doesn't do it. Judah fails. Judah has no more children. His wife is dead too. And so fear keeps him from doing the right thing. So we can think in our own lives of different times where fear has maybe prevented us from doing something. Maybe that's prevented us from standing up from someone that's getting made fun of. Maybe that's admitting to someone that you have wronged them, afraid of how they might react. Maybe you borrowed something from a friend and then that friendship kind of drifted apart, and then you feel bad because you still have something that belongs to them and you feel too awkward to give it back. Maybe there is someone owes you money and you don't want to embarrass them by relaxing that payment that they owe you. Maybe you are at work and someone is asking you to do something immoral or improper, but you're worried, you're fearful of your employment, so you're afraid to bring it up. So there's all these kinds of ways that fear can sometimes stop us from doing what is right. For Judah, the right thing in his culture and in his time is to give Tamar to Shelah so she can finally have children. But that fear of the future, the fear that something bad might happen, stops him. Now notice here, we are talking about this family that God has chosen to fulfill this mission of blessing. Judah is not perfect. He has fears. He makes mistakes. He doesn't always do the right thing. So let's go on a little bit here. We see that Tamar is sent away to live in her father's house. Judah even sends him out of his house to go back to her own father's house. Now, don't think of houses like we have today. These are more likely family compounds. So extended relatives and even servants living in clusters of tents or houses together. So she is sent over there. She is waiting and waiting and waiting. And as we think about this, as I thought about this, I imagine how long she must have waited to get to this point of desperation that we see from her, to make such a bold decision. For us, it's just a couple of sentences. But for her, it was years of waiting for Judah to finally provide, for God to provide a son so that she could be looked after as she got older. She can't just go to Judah and confront him. She doesn't have that ability. As a woman, she is left to the mercy of the men in her life to do that kind of communicating. So eventually she comes up with a plan. Judah gets ready to go shear the sheep. Now, the sheep we read were going to be sheared in Timnah. It's in a different area. They might have involved a whole bunch of different shepherds getting together for the sheep shearing. And so Judah sets off. And he sees this prostitute by the side of the road. And we read later that he maybe thinks this is a shrine prostitute. But what is a shrine prostitute? Well, these are common in a lot of religions. Not just the pagans around Israel, but the Greeks, the Romans, the Canaanites, the Hittites. they all had this kind of a system set up. And in this system, human intimacy was used as a part of the worship at these different temples and shrines. And it might have been a way of asking the gods for a good harvest or for successful sheep shearing, whatever it might have been. So that was maybe part of Judah's maybe stopping there to ask for it to be a good wool harvest. We don't know. Now, I will say some scholars say that that word that is translated as shrine prostitute is more of just a general term, meaning loose women or a general prostitute. So he maybe isn't going there for idol worship. It's a little unclear depending on how you translate that word. Either way, he sees Tamar there and he sleeps with her. And she ensures payment by asking for his seal, for his cord and staff. We can almost think about these things as his ID, his driver's license. They are implements of identification and authority. Later, he sends his servant to find this woman, this either the loose woman, shrine prostitute, however we want to think about this, and they cannot find her. So they stop looking so they don't embarrass Judah by searching for her too hard. And then we have this problem in the story, that Tamar becomes pregnant. And Judah is not happy about this. Tamar getting pregnant is seen as adultery. She must have slept with someone outside of the family. This is pre-law, but it seems like the punishment for adultery in that time was pretty harsh, if you read that in there. But she has the seal and the cord and staff. She has his ID. She's got his driver's license. And then she reveals to them, as they're leading her off for punishment, hey, I have these. This is the man who did it. And it's clear that these are Judah's seal and cord and staff. And here we get to another lesson. We need to be aware of judging others too quickly. Judah was quick to pass blame in this situation. He was quick to look for the faults. Probably he thought this was going to be his ticket to get rid of Tamar. He wasn't sure what to do with her. She's just kind of been there. He doesn't want to address her. We can just get rid of her now. We can just as easily place blame on others without thinking. There was a guy who was going to get his car fixed. He knew it was going to take a little bit more extensive repairs, and so he took it to the shop. He thought it might be a day or two, and then he didn't hear from them. And so, of course, like a lot of us, his mind began to overthink. Maybe this repair was going to be really bad. Maybe they found a whole lot more worse with it than what he thought. Maybe they didn't like him for some reason, and so they were just kind of sticking it to him. Maybe they forgot about his car. Maybe it was sitting in the back. Maybe they didn't think that he had the ability to pay for all of these extensive repairs, so they were going to do some other people's cars first. His mind began racing. And so he called after a little bit, and he found out it was just a couple of parts that were back-ordered. No big deal. It delayed it a little bit, but things were fine. See, our minds can jump to all sorts of conclusions. We think the worst of people. We think that the world is out to get us, or people are out to get us. Someone wants to ruin our lives or make us suffer. And 9 times out of 10, it's just an innocent mistake. Or we are just reading too much into the situation in general. So in this story, we see Judah, he sees the seal and cord, and he recognizes them as his own. And Judah makes this declaration. He says that she is more righteous than he is. And that phrase is kind of confusing to us. How is she more righteous? We see here that Judah is confronted with his heart of blame and his quick assumptions that would have condemned an innocent woman. We see that with her getting pregnant, she is actually showing loyalty to her husband, showing that she wants to carry on his family line. Judah was unwilling to risk that for his son, but she was willing to risk that for her husband. Judah, as the head of the household, he was in charge of the well-being of his children and their wives and their legacies. He has let his son down. He has let Tamar down. He has failed his duty to provide for her future well-being. And so Judah, declaring that she is more righteous, is his confession of guilt, that he did not care for her in the way that he should have. And in the context that they lived in, Judah's failure, this is important, in that context, Judah's failure to adequately care for her was worse than the offense of her prostitution. Him failing to adequately care for the people under his care was a worse offense than her prostitution in that context. In Judah's declaration, we see God's heart for people that cannot care for themselves. Widows, orphans, those with disabilities, others. We see that God desires that all people are supported, that they have their needs met. And that means that we should look out for those around us, care for people who are in need, care for people who cannot fully care for themselves. I was talking to Sherry Book recently. Many of you know her. She was widowed just this spring. Her husband died suddenly. And she was telling me about the ways that her church community came around her. She said that they appointed a man from their church. He's on their elder team to look after her, to look after the house, to look after the yard, to do all the things that she wouldn't think to do. They found a young guy from the community to do her lawn mowing, to take care of mowing her yard. She doesn't need the money. She doesn't need money. She's adequately sustained that way. But the rest of her family lives far away. They live in other states. And in the transition to life without her husband, Jay, that community is helping to care for her needs as a recent widow. In this story, we have Judah. His line becomes one of the 12 tribes. His son Perez, by Tamar, becomes the ancestor of David, ancestor of Jesus. That's why that's included in this story, to point to us this story is part of how Jesus gets here. Through this story, we have David and Jesus. And Judah is not a perfect man. He pushes his widowed daughter-in-law aside. He sleeps with someone he expects is a prostitute. This family is not perfect. Today, if Judah was in this church, I would have to have a little bit of a talking to with him about some of his actions, right? Like, this is not church-appropriate behavior. But he is the line through which we get David. He is the line through which we have Solomon and Jesus. So from this story, as we look at it, as we understand the culture and the context that it surrounds this complicated and a little bit of a dark story, we can draw out a few lessons that do apply to our time. We can notice when we might be afraid of doing the right thing. And if Judah would have done the right thing at that time, it would have saved a whole lot of headache on the back end, right? So we can notice when we might be afraid to do the right thing. We can make judgments too quickly, just like Judah made judgments too quickly. We can see the Bible teaching the importance of caring for people that cannot care for themselves. And as we look at this story in the larger story of the Bible, we can see how God works in our lives and through our lives, despite our failures, despite our fears, despite our selfishness, to bring about a greater plan and purpose that God is working on. So as we look at this passage, as we consider this story, we can be reminded of this family, this imperfect family that God is working through. Next week, we begin to see how they end up in slavery and are crying out for rescue. We can think about other ways that we might be in situations like Tamar, crying out for rescue, for a resolution. But for now, we can read this passage and understand the complexity of the world back then, and yet how it can still speak to our lives today. Let's pray. Dear God, we are thankful for your presence in our lives. We're thankful for the Bible in our lives. We're thankful that this book is full of all sorts of stories of imperfect people. Stories of people who sometimes make mistakes. Stories of people who do the wrong thing. And yet people that you still choose. People that you still work through. Lord, as we reflect on our own lives and our own imperfections, give us the faith to know that you will still work through us. Give us the assurance that even though we make mistakes and we do things that are wrong, that you still choose us. Ultimately, through Jesus, that you forgive us, that by your grace our wounds are healed and what has been done wrong to us or that we have been done wrong can be healed through Jesus. Lord, may we be so honored as to see the ways that you use our mistakes and our failures and imperfections for your glory. Lord, give us the ability to see those things in our lifetime. Lord, we thank you for the story of Judah and Tamar, and we ask that the lessons that we have learned in how to approach the Bible and see the truth that is beneath the cultural change over time can still bless us and minister to us and guide us today. Lord, we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
There you go, the story of Tamar. You know, there's a lot of stories like this in the Bible where we read it and on the surface it just doesn't make sense to us, or there are certain details that are just hard to explain or to put together because cultures change over time. The culture of the Middle East several thousand years ago is different than today living in North America. So it's important to be able to see this and recognize this, and then take the time to dig deeper and learn about what's maybe going on beneath the surface. Well, if you enjoyed today's message, I encourage you to give it a like, subscribe, and maybe put a review on, depending on what podcast service you're listening to. If you want to learn more about our church, you can find information at our website, scienceridgechurch.org. We also have a Facebook page where you can stay up to date on events that are happening. And there's going to be more of those coming up as we get closer to the Christmas season. So with all that said,